Let's look at some examples of ways we can repurpose the color palettes we create. Let's say red has an evil twin here, and we want to give her a different color scheme. Since she's made up of all the same parts as red, we probably still want swatches for each of these items. We just want them to be different colors. So what we can do is come up to the scene palettes up here, right-click, and choose Duplicate. Now, duplicate is different than clone. We'll go over clone next. Let's give this a name. So it looks like these are all the same swatches as in our other palette. But since we use that duplicate command, the link between these swatches and the colors in our scene has been broken. So these are being treated as brand new colors, even though they're the same color as in the other palette. This is basically the same as if I had gone through by hand, added new colors, and then just picked the same color with the picker. If I were to change these colors, nothing happens in our scene because the link to the swatch has been broken. Let me undo that color change. So to use this palette, we would want to change these colors and then go in and recolor our evil red. There we go. We've created an entirely separate palette for the evil red character. Next, let's look at cloning a palette. So let's say we colored this character to go into this scene. She looks fine here, but if we put her in a different scene, suddenly her colors don't seem quite right. They're too bright and warm for this environment. Fortunately, there's an easy way to adjust her colors for this new scene. This time, let's go to the palette, right-click, and choose Clone. We'll give it the name Red Gloomy, and then select that. Now, unlike when we use the duplicate command, with the clone command, the swatches in this palette are still linked to where they are in the scene. This palette is just overriding this palette. Now, we want to make a change to basically every color in this palette. Fortunately, there's a way to do that all at once. We can right-click and choose Tint Palette. Now, first of all, you're going to want to check Preview so you can see what you're doing. You're going to want to turn up the amount a little bit so that it actually does something. So I'm just going to come over here and use Command A to select all these colors. And now I can make adjustments to those colors with these sliders. This slider changes the hue. That's not really what we want. This is the saturation. And again, the amount determines the strength of the effect. This is the value, so it makes it brighter or darker. And then these are our red, green, and blue values. So we can see this environment is a lot cooler than that other one. So we want to bring up the blues. We probably also want to bring down the saturation a little bit, and maybe bring down the values to make it a little darker as well. Now, if there's a color you don't want to change, like say the highlight in her hair is now a little too dark to be a highlight, I'm just going to Command click to unselect it, and you can see it went back to its original color. So it's not going to be affected by this change. There are other things you can do here, but they're all basically the same effect as the offset. So once we have that all adjusted how we want, we can click Apply. Now if I wanted to go back and do something different to that hair highlight, I can adjust that separately. If I reset, it just resets the sliders. It doesn't actually undo the apply that we did before. Once we've adjusted the colors however we want, we can just close that, and there we go. We have a new palette with our new cooler colors. Now if we wanted to go back to the old one, we would just select the old one. So you can see this cooler palette fits much better in this scene. Now a word of warning, if we were to go ahead and say move on and start working on something else, it went back to the old palette. That's because our clone palette is below the old one in this list. So if we just use this arrow to move it up, that's going to override the ones below it. You could also just remove this one from the list. Now you don't have to worry about it at all. It's important to note, however, that removing that palette from the list doesn't actually delete it. If we look in our project folder, you can see you have a folder called Palette Library. And here we have both the red and the red gloomy still there. These PLT files, by the way, are what store your palettes. You can share these files with other projects if you want. If you need to get a palette back, you just click this folder option, and we can see it's still here on our list. Now, while we're looking at this window, it should be noted that this window is used to control at what level your palette is stored. For our purposes, we want everything just at the scene level. These other levels are for cases like in a studio where you might be sharing a palette among different people working on different scenes. But again, we're going to keep everything at the scene level. So let's say we did want to reuse a palette. For example, let's say we wanted to get our Evil Red palette from the other file we were working in. Well, the easy way to do that would be just to right-click in our Palettes menu and choose Import. Then we would just navigate to that other project, find its PLT file, and click Open. We can keep the same name here. Now we have access to all those colors in this scene. When you save, it is going to make a copy of that PLT file in this project's folder, so you don't have to worry about changes you make showing up in that other project. The last couple things I want to go over are some effects that let you control your colors. If we come down to our timeline and click this Add button, we can see that here we have the option to add several effects. Now, unfortunately, these can only be added to a single drawing layer. So if you had a character made up of a bunch of different drawing layers, you would have to apply these to each layer separately. This character is all on one layer, so we can see how these effects work. The first one is Color Override. This is similar to cloning a palette. I'm just going to click and drag this to make sure that it's applied to our drawing layer. There we go, now it's applied. If we double click this, we get this window that lets us pick a palette from our file, and then down here we can pick which colors from that palette we want to override. So let's say we want to override the shirt color. We then click this arrow to add it, and then click here to pick a new value for that color. So if you only want to change a color in a specific instance and don't want to mess around with a new palette, this might be a good way to do it. When you want to get back, you can just select that effect and delete it. The other effect I want to go over is the color scale option. This one is similar to the tinting we did earlier. If I double click to get the properties of this one, we can see we have similar options to when we were tinting. Now, the nice thing about the color scale effect, as opposed to tinting the palette, is that the color scale effect can be animated. So if I click on this first frame, and then use this button to add a keyframe, I can come out to a later frame, add another keyframe, and then I'll hit this plus sign to look at my values on the timeline. So you can see these are the same values we were working with earlier. If I change these back to the default of 1, and then close that up, we can see we can get an animation of the colors shifting. So if you need to animate a color change within your scene, this might be the way to go. That's it for the color palette. We've been doing a lot of work with vector drawing, but in the next video, I'm going to go over the options that are available to you when you're drawing on a bitmap layer.